Imagine if Occupy protesters were waving Chinese flags and calling for President Xi to liberate them from the United States. Wouldn't that be suspicious? Wouldn't it at least raise some eyebrows and probably discredit them? Well, that scenario is exactly what's happening in Hong Kong. Except these masked protesters are calling on President Trump to liberate them from China. And corporate media talking heads, the very same personalities who fixated on phantoms of Russian meddling in US elections, well, they're hailing these masked protesters as pro-democracy.
Pro-democracy protesters spilled into the streets.
Pro-democracy protesters braving the rain in Hong Kong.
Simply seeking liberty and freedom.
This is very much a protest led by the people. This is a protest that is spontaneous.
It's almost like this pro-democracy talking point used by every single corporate media outlet is part of a coordinated effort.
Pro-democracy.
Pro-democracy. Pro-democracy. Pro-democracy.
But what corporate media won't tell you is that the US government is deeply involved in the unrest gripping Hong Kong. Now, obviously, there's no way the United States can mobilize thousands upon thousands of protesters, but what it can do, and indeed does, is groom protest leaders ahead of time, so when an opportunity arises, the US is in position to redirect popular discontent to suit its own interests instead of the masses of protesters. Cynical stuff, huh? This is Joshua Wong. He's hailed in US media as the fresh face, the poster boy of Hong Kong's democracy movement. Netflix even made a documentary showcasing him as a hero. But what they don't tell you is that Wong works hand in hand with the US government. He's met with top neoconservative senators like Marco Rubio and Democratic Party elites like Nancy Pelosi. Wong testified on Capitol Hill, thanking Congress, not for the money it gave him, but for standing on the side of freedom.
I hope historians will celebrate the United States Congress for having stood on the side of Hong Kongers, the side of human rights and democracy. God bless Hong Kong. Thank you.
Wong was even caught on camera meeting with a political counselor from the US Embassy in Hong Kong. He received money from the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, what was created during the Reagan administration. In the words of co-founder Alan Weinstein, a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. And that's just scratching the surface of Wong and his fellow schemers' ties to the US government. This is Jimmy Lai. He's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and he's often called the Rupert Murdoch of Hong Kong. Lai is a central figure in the protest movement. He uses his tabloid media empire called Apple Daily, the biggest in Hong Kong, to promote the protests. The content is outright racist and xenophobic against mainland Chinese. Ironic considering Lai grew up on the mainland and came to Hong Kong as a kid to make his fortune. This full-page ad called pregnant women from mainland China locusts who are invading Hong Kong to steal resources. It's Hong Kong's version of the American right-wing trope about pregnant women pouring across the border to deliver so-called anchor babies in the US.
Anchor babies marching down the street because they want their parents to stay in our country.
And like Joshua Wong, Jimmy Lai is tight with Washington. This summer, he came to the US to meet with Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, and John Bolton, the most hawkish members of the Trump administration. This information isn't talked about in US media, but it shouldn't be a surprise. It's not like the protesters are trying to hide their affinity for the United States. In September, thousands of demonstrators waving American flags marched to the US consulate to make their demands heard. Not to the Hong Kong government, not to Beijing, but to Washington. Those demands happen to be the same ones that Marco Rubio is pushing for. Still not convinced the West is playing a major role in Hong Kong's protest? Watch this BBC report from 2014 on the Oslo Freedom Forum.
In the basement of this 4-star hotel, human rights activists come to what feels a bit like a school for revolution.
According to this report, plans for the 2014 Hong Kong protests, which today's are essentially a continuation of, were plotted long before they started.
This may not evoke the spirit of the barricades, but the teaching here is to be successful, to topple a government for good, you have to be organized and to plan meticulously. And activists here have been involved in helping to organize the current protests in Hong Kong. Their plan to put thousands of people on the streets of the territory was in fact hatched nearly 2 years ago.
And look who makes an appearance in the video.
I'm Joshua Wong, the convener of Scholars.
Who else is there? Pussy Riot, the young women who have been embraced by US media for, among other things, screaming profanities in a church to stick it to Putin. And then there's none other than Srđan Popović, the Serbian founder of the regime change mercenary group Canvas. Canvas has taken money from the US government and reportedly from the CIA to train untold thousands upon thousands of young people to topple governments around the world that the United States deems adversarial. One of the better-known Canvas trainees is Venezuelan coup frontman Juan Guaido. In other years, figures like Raed Saleh, face of the White Helmets, appeared to form. White Helmets are the propaganda arm of Al-Qaeda in Syria and are funded by the US State Department. The Oslo Freedom Forum is a who's who of regime change operatives, a clown car of charlatans, hucksters, and outright frauds. Past guests include Bill Browder, who stole hundreds of millions of dollars from Russia and renounced US citizenship to avoid paying taxes. In 2010, longtime Venezuelan opposition leader and convicted felon Leopoldo López spoke, and the Oslo Freedom Forum itself was founded by López's cousin Thor Halvorsen. Sounds like the Hong Kong protest leadership is part of an organic and grassroots movement, right? But what about the issue of police violence? Even if the protests are largely funded by the United States, that doesn't give cops an excuse to crack skulls. Well, judging by the huge amounts of video, the violence in Hong Kong has been initiated and mostly carried out by protesters. When they occupied the airport, they took a journalist captive and took turns beating him unconscious for hours. Then, when he was finally being carted away on a stretcher, one protester ran up and struck him with an American flag. Or how about this video of protesters clashing with outnumbered police? How would cops react here in the United States? I think it's a safe bet that American police would have zero tolerance and would have shot and killed the protesters. The one time Hong Kong police did open fire, well, that was shown endlessly in Western media. What they didn't show is that the rioters were assaulting police and citizens just before that. I'm not arguing as justification for the shooting, but it begs the question why corporate media is only showing the reaction and not the action. Seems like propaganda to me. In fact, police overreaction is actually what the protesters are hoping for. One of them spelled it out in the New York Times, calling it marginal violence theory. It calls for use of the most aggressive, non-violent action possible to push the police and to thoughtfully escalate non-violence. Maybe even resort to violence to push the government to the edge. Watch what Joshua Wong says after he's asked to condemn the violence the protesters have used.
I would say that instead of blame or condemn on any behavior of protester, I prefer to find out the solution and through the trial and error process, and to let us to realize that even protester, they will have the incentive or intention to have self-defense or self-protection. But how to use force and also keep and maintain public support is matter for us.
As we've seen, the protesters have gone far beyond mild force. Hong Kong's police have been relatively restrained. There have been injuries on both sides, but that's all. There haven't been any deaths. Compare that to, say, the Gaza Strip, where Israeli snipers have shot thousands upon thousands of unarmed protesters and killed 213 Palestinians, including children and medical personnel. So let's call what's happening in Hong Kong what it is. It's not a pro-democracy movement. It's a US government trained and funded violent separatist movement run by operatives that exploit the plight of Hong Kong's youth to enrich oligarchs and destabilize China. All in all, either the Hong Kong protest leaders are part of an international group of billionaire-funded regime change operatives led by the United States government as part of a Cold War agenda, or Donald Trump is actually a great liberator of Hong Kong.